morning. So from my understanding, during the summer, Oceanside Lutheran takes the time to kind of preach around some hot topics, which is really progressive for a congregation. So I very much appreciate that. Nevertheless, so our topic today is commercial sex exploitation. So I do want to put the disclaimer out. If you feel this might be a strong conversation or sermon for your kids, I totally understand that if you feel the need to walk out with them. I know sometimes these things can be very heavy, and that's okay. So for those who are a little unaware of this term, commercial, meaning a recognized market industry, and sexual exploitation is the product being distributed, which is dehumanizing to parties involved. So in other words, today we're going to talk about the global world of sex trafficking and the conflict with the gospel. So this past year, I served at a charter school in Philadelphia for former high school dropouts between the ages of 18 and 21. Our students come from all walks of life, whether they're teen parents, foster kids, victims of Philadelphia budget cuts, formerly incarcerated, or alternatively self-employed. Regardless, though, they are all part of our program. So who they once were does not necessarily determine who they are destined to become. But there was this one particular student that I was introduced to, who we'll call Dinah. My colleagues told me about Dinah because she had an opioids addiction, and a conversation with a sober woman would probably be most useful. So I reached out to her, and we had lunch in my office. What I thought would be a story about drug addiction turned into a history of sex work. Dinah lived in the motels with her pimp-turned-boyfriend. Before that, she was exploited by another man, 15 years to her junior. No older than 19, Dinah had been a sex worker since her high school years. And she wasn't alone either. Most of the girls in the motels were around her age. This wasn't necessarily the life she wanted. But how does one escape with no work experience, no diploma, and no housing? She wanted out. We wanted out. There must be a way out. Dinah and I cried, we hugged, and we agreed to touch base tomorrow. Dinah never made it back to school. She's not necessarily the Dinah we read about in Genesis, or is she? Jacob's daughter, Dinah, is the quiet type in a multi-parent household. After moving to a new place, she wanted to go out and meet her sisters under God, the other women of the land. You see, Leah's Dinah is described as innocent. Yet on her journey, she's captured the eyes of the man Sachem, who feels entitled to her body and to her spirit. He kidnapped her and raped her. And as we know of ancient biblical communities, a woman somehow is valued by her purity. So in this consumer culture, when a woman is taken advantage of, her market value decreases. So who will pay a dowry for a taken woman? If she's violated, she will either be a liability on her father or she will be forced into sex work. Dinah's agency was taken. Her future was disrupted by Sachem's hypermasculinity. Of course, rather than reconciling this wrong against her and her family, Sachem wanted to possess her. He asked Jacob to marry her off to him so a relationship may form between the families and communities could then flourish. Jacob, of course, is thinking of peacemaking and minimizing his own burdens. He was not able to see the value in his own daughter. Consenting to the demands of a rapist seemed greater than caring for the support of his own daughter. Have her. Mind you, in all of this, Dinah was not given a voice. She had no say in her future and her present. The only people speaking in this narrative were the men around her. The author of the story could not even find value in her opinion. As tragic as all this begins, it is not foreign to the story of women today. Regardless if we view a woman as mixy, prude, conservative, adventurous, or promiscuous, very rarely do we empower her to label herself. Women somehow do not get to decide when they want to be sexual. It's been decided for us. In middle school, we begin a culture of slut-shaming girls that develop faster than others. Because they have hips and breasts and receiving attention from boys and men, they must be sexually active, right? A poll was taken amongst women on Twitter of when they were first sexualized by society, and the most common age group was between 11 and 12. Statistics have shown that 1 in 4 women in the United States will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. Nearly a quarter will experience that before they are 18. Like Dinah, we never really had a say in whether or not our sexuality was for someone else to consume. Instead, the world has been speaking for us. We are spoken for by the world when our global economy is partially stabilized by commercial sex exploitation. Out of $150 billion in profits made a year from forced labor, $99 billion comes from sexual exploitation. I repeat, $99 billion. In a world where 1 billion people live in poverty, most of them being women and children, the marginalized do not get a voice in determining what type of work they are to be exposed to. Rural families sell their children into slavery, not knowing the type of injustices they will endure. Imagine being taken at 14, 15 years old to a brothel near a textile industry in Bangladesh. You are introduced to your new madam, given new clothes, a haircut, and a room. Your money for the first year goes to pay off your debt. Or envision getting dressed up to sit behind a glass window with 15 to 30 other women smiling at men in Thailand. They will walk past pointing at you like a child window shopping at a toy store. You will eventually age out of the market, but the market has proven to be immortal. We are spoken for by society when 79% of all human trafficking is sexual exploitation and 20% are children. 276 girls go missing from a school in Nigeria and the world will not say their names. Yet I can tell you every mass murderer in the United States since 1972. What does one man want with 276 girls aside to sell them to soldiers and countrymen for a good time? Every year, tens of thousands of US women and children go missing, only to be transported domestically and internationally for sexual exploitation. This week alone, it was reported that 14 girls from New York went missing. From New York. We are in New York. But the media would rather chastise girls wearing spaghetti-strapped tank tops and shorts at school. I wonder when we will finally teach boys and men how to control their sexual urges towards bare shoulders and legs instead of regulating a girl's body. And notice how it was never described what Dinah was wearing or what she looked like. Sexual exploitation, much like rape, is not about the body, but it's about power. If we are to identify as Christians and confess that God is the Almighty and all-powerful, then we have no business asserting power over any person, especially when it is the degradation of their personhood. We are spoken for every time we shame women for their role in the sex industry rather than questioning why the industry exists or shaming men who run it. We would rather read the Bible and count how many women are prostitutes rather than question why this religious biblical community built on loving God with your whole heart and loving your neighbor as yourself enabled a sex-for-profit culture. Questions that need answers. And that is why Jesus is more than the meek and mild lamb that dies on the cross for us. Jesus spoke on divorce, addressing a culture of injustice. When a man divorces a woman, he leaves her with nothing. She is forced to go back home or enter into prostitution. Men were doing this at this time merely because they wanted younger or prettier wives, a more fertile wife. And so when Moses permitted folks to get divorced, it inflated the power dynamics amongst couples. That in itself is an issue. This man who sat down with the oppressed, Jesus, heard the woes of the people and asked those questions. Why are there so many women on the street struggling to survive? How can we support a culture that continues to disenfranchise the marginalized? This calls him to question the validity of divorce. It is better to not marry than to cause such damage to another's welfare. Who then will speak for the Dinahs of the world? While Jacob tried to be diplomatic, his sons Simeon and Levi were furious. As a response to the violation done to their sister, the two men slaughtered everyone in the land. Through this whole scenario, God remains silent. If we are conscious of how God's voice is used through the Old Testament, we know that she has no issue in speaking out and condemning the actions of her people. But here, she did not. Now, I'm not saying that God is necessarily in favor of a mass slaughter of people in 2016. Rather, I believe God demands us to seek justice and encourage us to do right by her children. Recently, there was an article written about a number of Yazidi women, also known as the Force of the Sun Ladies. Has anyone read this article? The Force of the Sun Ladies are a military coalition in the war against ISIS. The Yazidi community is a Middle Eastern ethnic group with a faith background that incorporates Christianity, Zoroastrianism, I'm going to get that one day, and Islam. Nearly 5,000 Yazidis were captured by ISIS militants. And while in captivity, the Yazidi women were terrorized and lived as sex slaves. They were raped and tortured and trafficked between Iraq and Syria, while their terrorists continue to massacre their families and their loved ones. Somehow around 2,000 escaped. So the captain, Khatun Kidar, said, now we are defending ourselves. We're defending ourselves from evil. We are defending all the minorities in the region. And we will do whatever is asked of us. These formerly oppressed women have gotten together to be a military coalition to take down their oppressors. Who is speaking for the Dinahs of the world? We are living the modern day gospel, and today Dinah is speaking for herself. Dinah is the Yadizi women taking back what was stolen from them, a peace of mind. They are not relying on their brothers to combat their oppressors. They are not waiting on the diplomacy of the United Nations either. The Dinahs we see as the Yadizi women exemplify what a God of justice looks like. It is no longer about just them, but about all people in the region. More and more every day, we see those who have been in this industry of commercial sex exploitation doing the same thing and reclaiming agency for themselves. Whether they become counselors for other victims or heavily affiliated with organizations, interviewing with news networks to share their stories, or entering fields that curb human trafficking firsthand. Dinah is no longer just a secondary character in her own story. Since Christ came out of the tomb, we have all been renewed. That means the pain and oppression of our ancestors are alleviated. Our absence in Scripture is replaced with abundance. Christ reminds us that through him, he has given us new opportunities on earth. And the disinherited shall one day inherit all that is here. So I leave you with the following question. Should we treat our sisters like prostitutes? The same question Simeon and Levi asked of their father. Grace is a living, active verb described as a noun. Neutrality is its passive, removed cousin. Regardless of how society has trained us to look at certain professions, it will never justify the passivity towards one's emotional and physical well-being. Neutrality is a violation towards the 100,000 people in the Philippines, 400,000 people in India, 100,000 people in Taiwan, 200,000 people in Thailand, over 325,000 people in the United States, 100,000 people in Brazil, 35,000 people in West Africa, and 175,000 people in Eastern and Central Europe that are all being exploited on a daily basis. The second highest number in that is in the United States. What does it say about our Christian ideology if we remain silent about the 1 in 6 runaways that will be victims of sex trafficking? Can we faithfully continue to allow a quarter of our homeless youth to engage in survival sex or trafficking violations? Should we actively love our neighbors as ourselves, or are we just going to keep saying that we do? Pray for our sisters, Dinah, especially the Dinahs who may never receive justice. And even though we may have failed to protect them today, God is still present with them and with us. And God is calling us to be present in their journey. Amen.